My name is Elena Sokova. I'm the Executive Director of the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. And it's my very big pleasure to welcome you all to our special event today for the launch of one of the reports produced by the Center. And many of you know about the work of the VCDNP, but as we like to joke, we have three pillars. One is research-oriented with different publications and reports. The other one about the outreach and conducting result-oriented discussions. And some of you have been privy to some of our meetings and some of the public seminars and webinars. But we also have a capacity building pillar. And offer various training programs and opportunities for diplomats and practitioners. And today's event and the project itself kind of combines all of it. It's a culmination of the, I don't know how many, 5-6 months work? I would put it 6 months today. And it focuses on, the premise of it is it's very important to understand the experiences, particularly of developing countries, in their safeguards and implementation, and their motivations for joining or updating their various safeguards agreements. They don't often have a capacity to do it themselves, so we know that the International Atomic Energy Agency provides assistance and does outreach, and some of the states or group states are involved in helping them with that. But we thought that we would spend some time analyzing, like, what are the challenges, the difficulties they have in joining some of these agreements or updating them. And that was the focus of this project, which culminated now in the report that you will hear presentation today, with recommendations that are first of all, aimed at those who do outreach to these countries, and hopefully that these practical recommendations that we think they are will be taken into account when we do our outreach for work to these countries, and overall help to improve the safeguards and implementation, its effectiveness and efficiency. We were very pleased to partner for this particular project with VERTIC, and they have been a partner with several of our other projects. And we were also extremely delighted that we have had this opportunity to implement these projects and various parts of it with the support of the FCDO, United Kingdom Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. So that's really a big thank you goes to our supporters. A few words of logistics. We, as I mentioned, have the event streamed to YouTube, and it's also on Zoom. For those of you who are watching us and listening, if you wish to send questions to our presenter, please do so either using the Q&A function in Zoom or via email to events@vcdnp.org. So with this logistics out of the way, I'm very also happy that we have a pleasure today to have some opening remarks from Kory Sylvester, who is Director of the Division of Concepts and Planning at the Department of Safeguards at the IAEA. And he spent many years in other parts of the department, but also works for the Los Alamos or Livermore? Los Alamos National Laboratory in the US. So that is fantastic to have you with us. And I also want to use this opportunity is to thank again the IAEA's Department of Safeguards, who really were instrumental and creative and so helpful to conduct. Last week we had a one-week course on safeguards issues for diplomats, practitioners, and policymakers. So one more time, big thank you. We really appreciate what you guys doing. So with that, without taking more time, Kory, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And actually, maybe I will stay seated for this opening remarks, brief opening remarks. And I want to mention on behalf of Max Aparo, he sends his regrets. He would have wanted to be here to give these remarks himself. But I should begin thanking you, Elena and Noah, for having me here, and to congratulate both VCDNP and VERTIC for their work and in creation of this report, which I found very informative and useful. I know, well, both of these organizations have a long history of making contributions to the improvement of the safeguard system writ large. And I know, I guess, I don't know if Alberto Muti is here online. I understood he was supposed to be here, but was taken ill. So I wish him in particular good health. But of course, your report focuses on a subject of great interest and importance to the IAEA, and that is strengthening the safeguards legal framework. Last year, 2022, marked two notable anniversaries: the 50th anniversary of the conclusion of the first CSA in connection with the NPT, and the 25th anniversary of the IAEA Board of Governors' approval of the Model Additional Protocol. We reflected on both of those milestones at the Safeguard Symposium last November, which a number of you, I'm sure, attended. IAEA Director General Grossi reinvigorated efforts to facilitate the conclusion of comprehensive safeguards agreements by the handful of states party to the NPT who haven't yet chose to do so, and encouraged all states to conclude additional protocols and to rescind or modify SQPs based on the original SQP text. He has focused on this initiative because the strength of the safeguard system rests on two key components. First, states' commitments to forego the development of nuclear weapons, and second, that the IAEA can effectively verify adherence to that commitment. It is only when the legal framework is in place to enable effective safeguards that we can deliver on our verification mission. That in turn provides the confidence needed for nuclear cooperation and trade, allowing us to deliver on our agency's mission, Atoms for Peace, and of course, development. And John Carlson reminds us that safeguards in the report, his statement that safeguards is a collaborative partnership, one where we pursue shared objectives. And that's why universalization is so important, and the efforts we're focused on today. It is about establishing norms and providing confidence. Today, we still have 5 NPT non-nuclear weapon states parties that have not yet brought into force CSA agreements pursuant to Article 3 of the NPT. Out of the 99 states that have operative SQPs in force, 77 of these are now based on the strengthened revised text, but 22 still remain based on the original standard text. 11 states have rescinded their SQPs altogether. As DG Grossi has said, amendment by the remaining states of their old SQPs is essential to addressing a weakness in the IAEA safeguard system recognized by the Board of Governors already since 2005. To remind this audience, the old SQP suspends most of the safeguards measures in Part 2 of the CSA, so states are not required to submit an initial report on all nuclear material or to provide design information for facilities. And the IAEA cannot carry out inspections and design information verifications as a result. Therefore, the agency is unable to conduct in-field activities, and this poses a dilemma, as it cannot determine if the state still continues to meet SQP eligibility criteria. Therefore, the old standard text SQP is simply not adequate for our current safeguards system. Additional protocols, which provide additional safeguards measures for the agency to verify correctness, but also the completeness of states' declarations, are in force now for 140 states out of the 189 which have comprehensive safeguards agreements with the IAEA. So there's still some way to go. If you seek further information about how the agency is progressing in this domain, I point to the IAEA's plan of action in this area, which is also referenced in the report, and has been updated over the years, chronicling all the events that have taken place in support of this effort. The most latest revision was 22 and 23. So these are all important considerations for the effectiveness of the safeguard system, but I'd like to point out that there's even more value in establishing a strong legal framework for safeguards. These are benefits to states that conclude CSAs and APs and modify or rescind their SQPs. Implementing these obligations requires a solid nuclear and radiation regulatory infrastructure. That serves to protect the population from harm and also opens the door to nuclear applications in areas such as human health, food, water security, and agriculture. When states have their regulatory infrastructure in place and have a good handle on what is going on within their own borders, they're also in a position to help their neighbors, and we've seen evidence of that. We have seen our engagement with the SQP states and through our comprehensive capacity building initiative for SSACs and SRAs, so-called COMPASS initiative launched by the DG himself, that state-to-state collaboration is one of the most powerful mechanisms for capacity building. The value of sharing good practices cannot be overstated in this regard. We have also seen this in the expert meetings held to produce publications like nuclear energy departments in the agencies, enhancing nuclear safeguards infrastructure to support the introduction of nuclear power, our safeguards implementation practices guides, and recently and notably the COMPASS initiative itself. Establishing these partnerships and sharing good practices, mentoring other states, all of these serve to strengthen the entire system of safeguards implementation, making it resilient and sustainable for the entire international community. We as the IAEA remain ready to assist any state in their endeavor to take action on CSAs, APs, and modified SQPs. This is where VCDNP and VERTIC's research work is valuable. Better understanding the domestic and international factors that drive states to take action on CSAs, APs, and SQPs, and the challenges they face in doing so enable us to better help them through safeguards outreach and capacity building efforts. In so doing, the research project supports our COMPASS initiative through which we provide tailored support to these states. I commend again VCDNP and VERTIC on this important research project and trust that the insights gained from the research will help us all to achieve our shared goal, the one John Carlson mentioned in the report, to establish a strong legal framework that delivers peace and security, underpins cooperation on peaceful uses, and enables effective verification. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kory, and thank you for your kind assessment and kind words. And we do hope that indeed the work that has been carried out and the recommendations are useful for your work and for states that do engage in the outreach and assistance to the countries. But without spending more time, I think it's time to hear from the lead of the project and one of the key authors from Mayhew. And indeed, it's Alberto, if you're listening, we're very sorry you were not able to come to Vienna. But the report itself is a collaboration of several researchers, both from VERTIC, from VCDNP, probably more heavy on the VCDNP side, but nonetheless, it would not have happened without Noah's first vision of the project and also his leadership throughout all the time. Noah Mayhew is our research associate here at the center. also known as our in-house safeguards nerd. So he sleeps, breathes, and eats safeguards. So that's one of his passion areas of passion. But Noah, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Elena. I think I will take the podium for these remarks. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Before I begin, I want to join Elena in thanking the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office of the United Kingdom for the generous support for this project, as well as Kory for being here and the IAEA in general for its very kind support of our work across our different issue areas. I would also like to acknowledge my compatriot from the Verification Research Training and Information Center, as has been mentioned a few times, Alberto. Collaborated with us on this project, and it's unfortunate that he was not able to be here. So, jumping right in. The seeds of this project were planted through the work that the VCDNP has done on safeguards over the years. On one hand, we see a major goal of non-proliferation is the universalization of safeguards. And what we mean by that, of course, is that all states parties to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons conclude their Comprehensive Safeguards Agreements, or CSAs, as required by the treaty, that states conclude additional protocols, and that states with the outdated Small Quantities Protocols, or SQPs, that were mentioned in Kory's remarks, are amended by the states that still qualify for them under the strengthened text and rescinded as from those who no longer qualify under the new text. In the context of this presentation and in the report itself, we've taken these three things collectively to mean taking action on safeguards, sort of a term of art that we've created. So that's on one hand, this goal of non-proliferation. On the other, states do face challenges, as Helena pointed out in her opening remarks, in taking these steps, primarily related to national capacity, to awareness about the benefits of taking action on safeguards, or in many cases, awareness on the information of safeguards instruments themselves. Laura Rockwood, who also consulted on this project with John Carlson, talks about three categories of states that have not taken action on safeguards: the unwilling, the unaware, and the unable. In the category of unwilling falls a small handful of states that, although they are well informed about safeguards and have the requisite resources to take action, choose for political reasons not to do so. The majority of states, however, fall into the other two categories. They may be unaware of the value to them of effective safeguards or how to implement them, or they may be unable to take action on safeguards due to competing priorities and limited resources. And it's really the latter two categories that we will be talking about today. To help mitigate these challenges and to further the goal of universalization, the IAEA, states, and groups of states conduct capacity building and outreach activities with countries that have not yet taken on safeguards as applicable to those states. As Kory mentioned, the IAEA looks at these outreach activities through the plan of action to promote the conclusion of safeguards agreements and additional protocols. The plan of action was developed in response to a request from NPT states parties in 2000 and has been updated at regular intervals to also include outreach on the amendment and rescission of outdated SQPs once that revised standard text was approved by the Board of Governors in 2005. The IAEA also conducts extensive capacity building activities in states at their request. And for their part, some states and groups of states also conduct capacity building and outreach activities on safeguards, as Elena mentioned again in her opening remarks. So herein comes the study. The questions that we wanted to answer were as follows. How can outreach and capacity building activities be strengthened and maximized? Why is it, in a more general sense, that states take action on safeguards or don't take action on safeguards? What are the challenges that states face in entry into force and implementation, and how do they mitigate those challenges? Or conversely, what challenges are they still facing after entry into force that we could better address? To answer these questions, during the project, we interviewed 17 states that had taken recent action on safeguards, and we asked them these questions, but also other questions, depending on that state's experience. The ultimate goal of this process and the project was twofold. First, we wanted to provide actionable, member state-driven recommendations for the IAEA states and groups of states that conduct outreach and capacity building activities on safeguards, as I've said a couple of times, to maximize the impact of that outreach. Second, we wanted to preserve institutional memory for these countries' stories by telling them in the report. And that's why you'll find in the report, for those of you in person, you have paper copies. It's also available on our website. The second half is dedicated, indeed, to telling these case studies, as we've called them, for countries. As a result of the interviews with the representatives of these countries, we were able to divide our findings initially into 5 themes, which I'll talk about in just a moment. And then later, we held a workshop here in Vienna, Austria, where we were able to bring 10 of these member state representatives here to talk to us in more depth, and as I like to liken it, pressure cook these themes into recommendations. And we ended up with 24 recommendations, which we hope will be useful. So the themes, what are they? They were designed based on either the primary drivers or motivations for states to take action on safeguards, either with their CSAs, their APs, or their SQPs. In many cases, the state had taken action on a combination of those things for a variety of reasons, either all at the same time or over a period of years based on different outreach activities. So the themes we found are the following. Expanding access to peaceful uses of nuclear energy, science, and technology, stressing the state's non-proliferation commitments, leveraging pre-existing national and regional structures to facilitate action on safeguards, raising awareness at all levels of the state government, and building capacity for implementation, which, as I'll explain later, itself has been cited as a catalyst for countries to take action on safeguards. And now it's important to note, as you'll hear, that to some extent these themes and some of the recommendations bleed into each other a little bit. That's perhaps a sixth theme, and it's really on purpose, that states often take action on safeguards based not on just one motivation, but on a confluence, because of a confluence of factors. So for the rest of this presentation, I will go through the 5 themes and recommendations under each one and include examples from the countries that we spoke to. These themes, as I've said in the report, comprise a kaleidoscope of factors that should be considered when conducting outreach and capacity building activities on safeguards. And it's our hope that the analysis and the recommendations in the report will serve as a reference, not just to improve the impact of outreach and capacity building on safeguards, but also to bring more stakeholders to the table to contribute to existing activities. So we start with the first theme, which we identified, and that was related to expanding access to peaceful uses. The majority of states interviewed, in fact, I think all of them, stressed that action on safeguards had been driven by the desire to expand the access for their state to the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, science, and technology. So as a general statement, we've pointed out that exploring additional ways, further ways to responsibly leverage the nexus between peaceful uses and safety, security, and safeguards would increase the impact of outreach and capacity building activities. One example of this is that of Benin. When Benin's Minister of Health in 2016 requested support from the IAEA to establish a radiotherapy facility for cancer treatment, the IAEA's Department of Technical Cooperation encouraged Benin to put into place a regulatory body to enable it to inspect the radiotherapy center, to license it, and to meet some basic safety standards before procuring equipment. This provided the incentive, which at that time had been lacking for more than 10 years, for Benin to bring into force its nuclear law, to establish a regulator and to bring into force its CSA with an AP and an SQP, which ended up entering into force in 2019. All three instruments, though, had been signed in 2005. But the high-level political interest in bringing them into force was still lacking until this process really got going in 2016. So in other words, while the radiotherapy facility in question would not be using nuclear material, the advancement of peaceful uses for Benin was a motivator to take action on safeguards, whereas this motivation had previously been lacking. That's just one example. In the interest of time, I would love to tell all of these countries' stories, but I'll now focus on the recommendations that we boiled down from this theme. The first is that when engaging with countries that are not yet members of the IAEA or have little to no nuclear activities, the IAEA states and groups of states should recall the challenges faced by these countries related to the lack of capacity and high-level awareness of the benefits of peaceful uses. In this regard, the following outreach approaches could be considered, and we talked about these as well at the workshop. First, share experiences of other similarly situated states where regulatory functions are anchored in a relevant ministry, such as health or agriculture, as well as safety, security, and safeguards, which I'll refer to from now on as 3S, are combined under the one regulator. Second, facilitate national or regional events, or more of them, where peaceful uses and related IAEA initiatives, such as Rays of Hope that do not have to do with safeguards, as such, can be promoted to high-level policymakers. The second is that more opportunities should be created to engage policymakers in ministries of health, agriculture, and finance, as well as parliamentarians on the benefit of peaceful uses and its relationship to its safeguards obligations. This allows decision makers more occasions to engage directly with experts from the IAEA and build an understanding of both peaceful uses and of safeguards obligations that are related. The third recommendation under this theme is that strategies for safeguards outreach should take into account the extent to which the state uses nuclear and other radioactive material and take steps to support the state such that the cost of implementing safeguards doesn't, either in perception or in reality, outweigh the benefits of peaceful uses. And then the fourth recommendation under this theme is that outreach and capacity building efforts aiming to increase a state's regulatory capabilities should support an approach that is in step with and in proportion to its peaceful uses program. In this regard, consideration should be given to the development of what we talked about as a graded roadmap approach for regulatory capacity building, perhaps with the support of research conducted by non-governmental organizations. So that was our discussion on peaceful uses. The second theme that we identified had to do with states' non-proliferation commitments and how they saw them. As important for the majority of states that we interviewed as peaceful uses was the desire to stress their commitment to the global non-proliferation regime, including their obligations under safeguards. On the one hand, several states interviewed said that in discussions with their respective governments on whether or not to take action on safeguards, that successful arguments were characterized by the sentiment, what do we have to hide? Why not take action on safeguards? What does it look like if we don't? Several of the countries that we interviewed emphasized their responsibilities to their regional neighbors as what they called countries in a global village. On the other hand, the argument for action on safeguards in developing countries, particularly least developed countries that have little to no nuclear activities and don't have or aspire to embark on nuclear power, these arguments become harder to make. Moreover, these states often require extensive capacity building and additional financial and human resources to implement safeguards effectively. So an example of this theme in practice as a success story was with Sudan, whose SQP was outdated until just a few years ago. One diplomat who took part in actually our own capacity building activities here at the VCDNP learned of their outdated SQP, as well as Director General Grossi's concern that drawing credible safeguards conclusions was becoming more difficult for states with SQPs under the outdated model text. he was able to take action in his own country to advance the amendment process, which was already under discussion at the time but had not begun. Both he and another official that we spoke to from Sudan said that adhering to the global non-proliferation norms was one of their primary motivations for taking action and amending the outdated SQP. Again, this is just one example from the many countries that we spoke to. And after our interviews and the workshop that I mentioned, we were able to see these recommendations come to the forefront. The first recommendation under the non-proliferation commitments theme is that as demonstrating the value of taking action on safeguards can be difficult to countries that have no nuclear material, those conducting outreach and capacity building activities should more often focus on formulating state or region-specific strategies to provide credible answers to the question, what's in it for us? More effectively demonstrating the value of safeguards for these countries would advance existing outreach activities as they stand. Moreover, sharing those strategies with others that conduct outreach and capacity building activities, perhaps through the establishment of a formal outreach forum that would meet annually and convene all of those stakeholders who conduct these activities already, would benefit the outreach activities that everybody conducts, sharing strategies. The next recommendation under the non-proliferation theme is this. As non-proliferation and peaceful uses comprise two of the three pillars under the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, states parties to the treaty should consider outreach and capacity building activities during the review cycle itself. This could include a commitment in the final document of the next NPT review conference to support developing countries and least developed countries in their efforts to establish and maintain regulatory bodies and state systems of accountancy and control of nuclear material, while also supporting expanded access to peaceful uses. Such support would also need to be concrete, time-bound, and involve both financial and technical contributions from a variety of states, including those that do not already conduct these kinds of activities. The seventh recommendation in the total report, you'll notice that the numbering continues, is that the IAEA, states and groups of states should collaboratively explore the complementarity of safeguards with other issues in nuclear governance when planning for, implementing, and evaluating the effect of safeguards outreach. Particularly for developing countries and least developed countries, safeguards legislation and implementation often overlaps with other subjects such as export controls, nuclear security, radiological security, nuclear safety, and border control policies. Considering outreach for many of these related fields together could increase capacity across the board in a more effective and efficient way. Our next recommendation under this theme, number 8, is also related to this, and that's that more research should be done on how to maximize the complementarities between nuclear safety, security, and safeguards, in particular as concerns conditions in developing countries. Such research could be funded by national governments and carried out by, you guessed it, non-governmental organizations. The value, though, I should point out, of non-governmental organizations doing this kind of work is because they remain neutral of any national agenda and, frankly, are more likely to have the bandwidth, the time to dedicate to this kind of in-depth research. And then the last recommendation under the non-proliferation theme is that while frequent reminders from different parties could be considered nagging, a lot, which is what, by the way, I thought when we entered this process, a lot of the member state representatives that we spoke to remarked on the great value of regular outreach, even in the form of simple reminders, to remind them on the need to take action on safeguards to fulfill their non-proliferation commitments. In particular, for states with very small offices dealing with lots of different issues, a lack of response doesn't mean no. It may well just mean a lack of bandwidth and lots of other stuff to do. Moving on, we have this unwieldy term leveraging, but that's sort of the best way we could think to call it. And so on its face, this term doesn't mean very much, but there were 3 things we identified that we can call leveraging that facilitated states taking action on safeguards. The first was to utilize pre-existing national committees established for purposes other than safeguards to take advantage of political momentum, basically. So an example of this was a high-level committee established in Guinea-Bissau for the implementation of United Nations Security Council Resolution 1540, but that was later used to facilitate safeguards entry into force. Such committees are frequently characterized by, and by the way, Guinea-Bissau is not the only country that has taken this approach, and it's proved successful in several of the states that we interviewed. Generally speaking, the countries who have already done this have these committees that have really frequent meetings, direct and regular access to high-level officials by the working level, people, diplomats or practitioners that are engaged in or responsible for related disciplines, again, like nuclear security, export controls, and so on. The second kind of leveraging we talked about was a discussion on how to better responsibly leverage access to peaceful uses to improve the safeguards capacity of the country or regions concerned. So when I say responsibly, what I mean here is that safeguards and peaceful uses should not be viewed as confrontational or transactional to one another, but rather they should be viewed, as Kory mentioned in his opening remarks, as mutually reinforcing, as complementary to one another. Outreach and capacity building activities should emphasize this symbiotic relationship as much as possible, and indeed to build upon it as much as possible. The third kind of leveraging that we talked about was that interviewees and workshop participants emphasize the need to identify ways to better leverage the role of and support from regional organizations. This includes, but is certainly not limited to, the African Commission on Nuclear Energy, AFCON, the Agency for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in Latin America and the Caribbean, OPNAL, and of course, Euratom. All 3 of these were cited by individual states during interviews for their contributions to increased capacity for safeguards implementation. So the question becomes, how can we better leverage these organizations and others better? So from all 3 of those kinds of leveraging, we were able to formulate these recommendations. First, under this category, when engaging with states on safeguards, the establishment of these cross-sectoral interministerial commissions or committees on nuclear matters should be encouraged. Such bodies, like I said, should meet regularly, maybe once a week, maybe once a month. That sounds like a lot, but I believe that such committee in Guinea-Bissau does meet either every week or every month. And these committees should have direct access to the ministers or individuals in equivalent positions, or even the offices of heads of state. The next recommendation under this category, number 11 in the report, is that the establishment of a 3S regulator that also deals with other disciplines, maybe potentially export controls or customs policy, can be useful for ensuring the effective and efficient standards for the country in nuclear governance. This practice would also help facilitate further access to peaceful uses, insofar as it is responsible for regulating arrangements between the IAEA and end users in the state. Planning, implementation, and evaluation of outreach should consider this practice, especially for small states, developing states, least developed countries, those that have new regulatory bodies or state accounting and control systems, and even for those just establishing them in particular. Next, we'll talk about a recommendation regarding regional bodies. This is, as I mentioned, Euratom, AFCON, OPNAL, but also the Association of Southeast Asian Nations and the Asia and Pacific Safeguards Network. We'd be here all day if I named all of them. But also groups of states, such as the Friends of the Additional Protocol, just to name one, should share their experiences with one another on safeguards outreach and capacity building in order to increase the impact of these activities. This could be done, as I mentioned earlier, through the establishment of an official outreach forum that would meet annually, or perhaps biannually. This is the same committee I mentioned under the theme on stressing non-proliferation commitments. Moving on, we have argued that more research should be conducted on the domestic legislative processes in countries as concerns the nuclear field in order to inform strategies for safeguards outreach for individual countries. Now, it's important to note that this is a practice that is conducted by some already in its beginning stages. It would benefit, though, from research conducted by non-governmental organizations that have the bandwidth to provide in-depth analysis on opportunities and challenges for encouraging states to take action on safeguards. This research could be funded by states and groups of states that already conduct outreach and capacity building activities. And then the last recommendation under this theme is that the IAEA should conduct regular internal workshops to compare notes between departments of safeguards, nuclear safety and security, nuclear applications and technical cooperation, as well as the Office of Legal Affairs on their outreach efforts, with which countries they are liaising, what the effect of that outreach has been. It is our understanding that there is coordination within the IAEA already on these matters, but institutionalizing it and doing it more often would be our recommendation. Because we've argued this would increase coordination on outreach within different departments, offices, and increase the effect overall. The fourth theme we talked about was a little bit more obvious from the research, and this was awareness raising. All of the states interviewed for the project emphasized the importance of awareness raising among all of the stakeholders within their governments. Now, this includes high-level engagement, such as between heads of state, between a single head of state and the IAEA, Director General, and with ministers of foreign affairs, energy, health, defense, and so on. The importance of awareness raising at the working level, though, was equally emphasized by the people that we spoke to, including among diplomats, government officials, and regulators, particularly during international gatherings like the IAEA's General Conference. Interviewees also noted in this regard the importance of messaging and outreach that is tailored to the states concerned, conducted with the knowledge of national bureaucratic processes and sensitive to the state's needs. This messaging should also bear in mind the ambitions of the state for developing both power and non-power applications in the future of nuclear science and technology. So return to this need for tailor-made answers to the question, what's in it for us? These were cited as particularly important aspects of outreach strategy. We also spoke to a number of states whose action on safeguards was facilitated by what we're calling safeguards champions. These are individuals, like in the case of Sudan, who understand the importance of safeguards and are motivated to take action. Now, Sudan was certainly not the only example of this. How safeguards champions separately come into this theme is that they're often in positions to both pass information directly to those at the ministerial level, as well as to disseminate information for further targeted outreach among their peers. And a great vehicle we heard about this was, again, the General Conference. Now, for example, Cameroon, which had an outdated SQP until 2019, but already had a CSA and an AP in force, brings quite a diverse delegation to the General Conference. When the simplified procedure for amending outdated SQPs was explained, it took very little time for them to do so. Because the right people were in the room, from both the working and ministerial levels. Awareness through this simple thing, diversity in the delegation, was raised. So here are some recommendations more concretely from the awareness raising theme. Number 15 in the report, first under this section, is that the IAEA states and groups of states would benefit from conducting more high-level safeguards outreach events at the General Conference where countries, and this is really the meat of the recommendation, can share their own experiences with each other. The next one we talked about, next recommendation we spoke about in this theme was that strategies for outreach on safeguards should take a top-down, bottom-up approach as much as possible, by which awareness is raised at the highest levels of government through direct outreach by the IAEA Director General, other ministers and heads of state to their counterparts in the target country, as well as at the working level through capacity building conducted already by the IAEA, states and groups of states, as well as non-governmental organizations. This next recommendation is related. Further to these top-down, bottom-up approaches, strategies should support internal exchanges between working level staff in countries and the higher level decision makers. This can include designing capacity building activities that both the high level and working level officials take part in, with the explicit message that while the high level officials will have to take the decision to act on safeguards, working level officials will be the ones responsible for implementation and liaising with others. These exchanges could also be facilitated by encouraging, again, the highest level of participation in the General Conference. Moving on to the next recommendation, number 18 in the report, awareness raising is aided, we were told, by the availability and dissemination of concise, easily digestible information across multiple languages about the safeguards instruments themselves, the process of entry into force, and more general information about nuclear, such as the difference between nuclear and other radioactive material, and the difference between power and non-power applications. This information is already produced to some extent by the IAEA, could be produced even further by the IAEA states and groups of states or non-governmental organizations. In these, we've imagined them to be these easy-to-use briefing packets, potentially tailored to the target country or region concerned. Potential vehicles for dissemination of these materials could be these national safeguards champions who could amplify this message internally through relevant regional organizations also. And then the last recommendation under this theme is that awareness should be raised further about the capacity building opportunities and educational resources that already exist. These include the IAEA's Safeguards Traineeship Program, IAEA Advisory Services, one of which Kory mentioned, COMPASS, the Comprehensive Capacity Building Initiative for SSACs and SRAs, as well as ISAS missions. These are Safeguards and SSAC Advisory Services, and the Integrated Nuclear Infrastructure Reviews that the IAEA already conducts. This also includes opportunities offered by national governments, such as the United States Department of Energy's INSEP program, the International Nuclear Safeguards Engagement Program. And I would be remiss if I did not also point out more awareness could be raised about the opportunities that non-governmental organizations like the VCDNP and VERTIC conduct. And then, so the final theme we identified under the project related to capacity building for effective implementation of safeguards. Several of the state officials that we interviewed during the project remarked that there was no sense in bringing a safeguards instrument into force if the state had no capacity to implement it. By the same token, efforts by the IAEA and others to build capacity were cited in some cases as by themselves being catalysts for the state concerned to take action on safeguards. So further consideration should be given to ensuring the sustainability of implementation once the safeguards instruments are enforced for the country. 3 specific opportunities were identified here. These are cross-disciplinary training, these are geographical sensitivity and the importance of it, as well as fixing challenges related to staff retention in countries. In terms of cross-disciplinary training and geographical sensitivity, we spoke to a number of countries with fledgling regulatory authorities or state accounting systems who talked a lot about how small their offices were. In the case of St. Lucia, for example, they currently have exactly 3 people dealing with IAEA matters. And that's not all nuclear matters either. These are in the Ministry of External Affairs. These are the current National Liaison Officer, the current National Liaison Assistant, as well as a 3rd individual who is now on a bilateral desk, but continues to work on IAEA matters to support the NLO and the NLA. These people take on these responsibilities in addition to what their primary job titles are, in addition to what their imagined responsibilities are supposed to be. So if you're one of these individuals, you're dealing with a great variety of issues. In certain cases, it might make sense to offer training across multiple different issue areas, depending on the need of the state concerned, including safeguards, security, legislative assistance, and so on, all of the things that I've mentioned before. And in some specialized cases, it may make sense to offer training on various other issue bundles as well that the IAEA does not do work on, including export controls, customs regulations, that don't have to do with nuclear radioactive material. As I alluded to, some of this the IAEA can do and already does. Well, some would require national governments to step in or to collaborate. In terms of geographical sensitivity, and this is along this same vein, imagine that your bandwidth is that small and you're offered a trip, even if it's paid, halfway around the world for a week to do a training course. How likely is it, do you think, that your office is able to spare you for a week? Think of this as a logistical problem. Think of the travel time even. Geographical sensitivity means, for purposes of this study, that we need to look into more ways to host trainings closer to home, either regionally or even nationally. Finally, in terms of staff retention, the example would be Sri Lanka, which is trying to bring its additional protocol into force for a number of years, but is having trouble hiring and keeping on staff a lawyer to help revise its nuclear law. Imagine that you are an individual who is able to get this highly specialized training to work in this field for your country. The opportunities may increase tenfold for you to be hired outside of your country or to be hired for a more specialized job that doesn't contribute to nuclear governance in your country. These are a few examples which are better explained in the report, but suffice it to say, here are the related recommendations. First in this theme, strategies for capacity building and outreach to consider the value, again, on a case-by-case basis, because this wouldn't work for everybody, of conducting training across disciplines when the departments and offices in that country also deal with other subject matter areas like export controls, nuclear security, and so on. And in any event, geographical sensitivity should be considered when planning capacity building activities. Now this, as I said, includes conducting more training on a national and regional basis, as well as preparing related budgets to account for difficulties in obtaining visas and planning flights. I won't tell tales out of school to respect privacy, but getting lots of developing countries around the table for a one-day workshop had its challenges, and I suspect that others who conduct outreach have experienced that as well. The 21st recommendation in the final report is that, as most of the recommendations contained, and you've probably been thinking of this the whole time I've been talking, as most of the recommendations that we are offering do require money, they require financial backing, it would be useful for states that do not already conduct capacity building activities to begin doing so. They could begin doing so in cooperation with established bodies that conduct this outreach, or independently, as long as it's still in a coordinated manner. Seeking non-traditional sources of funding is also an option, including private foundations and other sectors of government that don't already contribute to these activities in terms of funding. And then a third option would be for interested member states to pool funds through their member state support programs, or coordinate démarches with the aim of convincing governments that don't support outreach or capacity building activities today to begin doing so. Moving on, number 22 in the report, those conducting capacity building activities should bear in mind the importance of continuous training and reviews, especially in the establishment and the maintenance of state systems for accountancy and control. To this end, the IAEA states and groups of states should coordinate on which training courses have been conducted in which countries and ensure that support is being offered on an ongoing basis. But let's not put all of the onus on the people doing the outreach. States that require capacity building activities should not be shy in contacting those who have done training in the past to request follow-up visits. The IAEA's advisory services, as noted previously, are one of the options for this, as well as, of course, the training conducted by governments and non-governmental organizations. 23 in the final report, capacity building for implementation consists not only of training, but also on material support, like software. During the workshop, it was remarked quite a lot, I have to say, on how helpful the further development of software, such as the Regulatory Authority Information System, RISE, produced by the IAEA, as well as the Protocol Reporter 3 had been and would continue to be in the future. And they said further efforts to make these and similar programs easy to use, customizable for the state, and in some cases able to serve as accounting for a variety of things, all nuclear material and radioactive material and all different uses in the country, rather than, in the case of one country, having to maintain like 2 or 3 different databases. Would be a continuous exercise they would recommend to ensure that they're able to report effectively to the IAEA. And then the last recommendation in our report was this. While much of the report is focused on outreach to and capacity building for experts who are in country, consideration should be given for ways that country experts could spend extended periods of time at the IAEA and then return to their capitals. So this could include more funding for the IAEA's Safeguards trainee program, but it could also include more temporary IAEA staff positions for developing countries, as well as particularly countries who are struggling to implement safeguards for their countries. These positions, I'm thinking consultants or cost-free experts, there would have to be some bureaucracy in terms of what they're called, would allow those who receive them to get an inside view, so to speak, of the agency and serve as on-the-job training, while still contributing to the IAEA's daily operations. For this to be effective, it would be important for such trainees to remain in their post for fixed periods of time and then return to their countries. Funding for these positions would, of course, have to come from interested governments or private foundations. And by the way, this recommendation is not limited to positions at the IAEA, but could also take place in national laboratories, so subject to the country concerned. So I have spoken probably for far long enough. I have a few concluding notes before we jump into Q&A. The IAEA's plan of action to promote the conclusion of safeguards agreements and additional protocols has been mentioned a few times, in addition to the outreach efforts that it now includes on small quantities protocols since the revised text was approved by the board. While member states do continue to praise the action in the General Conference resolution on the effectiveness and efficiency of the safeguards system, relatively few bodies outside the IAEA conduct robust outreach and capacity building activities on safeguards. The efforts of those who conduct these activities now are unquestionably laudable. We are in no way trying to criticize or duplicate these efforts, but it's also time for innovative thinking on ways for the international community to work collaboratively to further enhance the impact of activities in outreach and capacity building. It's particularly important to note in this regard the inherent link between safeguards and nonproliferation on the one hand and peaceful uses and development on the other. They're two sides of the same coin. As one participant in the workshop we conducted observed, sustainable development cannot be realized without peace and security security cannot be realized without sustainable development. Many participants in the workshop noted the opportunity to share their experiences with other states was invaluable and should be an ongoing activity. The opportunity to tell one story and learn from those stories of others can be a critical step in identifying the gaps in existing outreach and capacity building activities. It's worth noting, by the way, that we were not able to reach all of the states that we had wished to reach, and this is attributable, again, to lack of human resource capacities in many countries. In other words, when you're one person doing the job that multiple teams and multiple departments in other governments do, you may not have the time or bandwidth to answer an email, or even 10. The VCDNP and VERTIC encourage viewers, particularly those who are in a position to affect funding in your countries or international bodies, to read the case studies in our report, to learn from them as the project team has. Funding for safeguards, outreach, and capacity building is not just a non-proliferation issue, but it's also a development issue. By bringing this truth, as we have seen it, to the forefront in fora like the NPT review process, the IAEA General Conference, and the UN General Assembly would be crucial to the successful improvement, for the successful implementation of safeguards in the future. Active efforts to bring attention both to key decision makers and governments, as well as the general public, about the linkage between safeguards and peaceful uses is critical to all countries, but particularly important to emphasize to developing countries. It's in the best interest of all countries that safeguards be as strong and as resilient as possible. For that to be the case, robust outreach and capacity building activities are required on a continuous basis and in a cooperative manner to include developed countries that don't already conduct these activities. So all of that to say, we hope that the recommendations contained in our report will contribute meaningfully to these ends, and that this report brings more attention to the human stories behind these issues. Thank you for your attention. I should do my last round of thank yous. Thank you again to the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office of the United Kingdom for supporting this research. Thank you very much to the projects team who worked tirelessly under me, unfortunately for them, running around, endlessly chasing them for things. Thank you to Ingrid Kirsten, Senior Research Associate here at the VCDNP. Thank you to Louis Reitman, another Research Associate here at the VCDNP. My partner in crime, Alberto Muti, who is the co-director of the Verification and Monitoring Program at VERTIC. And of course, Laura Rockwood and John Carlson, who consulted on the project. So now I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you, Noah, very much. I know it's a lot of information to absorb, but I think that the issue is extremely important, and I'm sure many of these recommendations will find some resonance within the agency or within the countries that implement the outreach, and among the countries themselves that are looking into these issues. So with that, I'm very happy to open the floor for comments or questions, suggestions.
Actually, if
yes,
I might,
please,
actually, I wanted to make a few introductions myself. I brought with me some colleagues from the IAEA, very relevant to this discussion, so I won't let them go unnoticed here. Susan Pickett is over here in my division leading our efforts on training and Compass that has come up often here. I've got Jenny Risanen here also from my division leading our strategic planning and a number of outreach efforts such as the symposium that I mentioned previously. She was the head of that. And I've got Anke here, Terhove, comes to us from the Dutch ministry and added to our team here with a number of engagement sort of items in her portfolio. So with that.
Oh, I'm so happy you wrote that deal. But yes, please introduce yourself before.
Wait for the microphone.
Ah, okay, this is the procedure. Before you speak, we'll pass a microphone to you.
Otherwise they won't hear you.
You introduce yourself and then...
My name is Valery Bычkov. I'm former safeguards inspector. I would like to thank VCDNP very much for organizing this event, and Noah for very good presentation and for work done. I think it is very useful work. And I have few comments on this. First, I already noted to note that this title looks ambitious. It speaks about understanding states' experiences in safeguards, meaning the whole safeguards. But also because Noah was so kind that he sent to potential participants the text in advance, so I was able to read it before I came here. And I started to look for the majority of information and found that actual information relates to mostly to the SQP states, right? And I see now even after Noah has so nicely presented the work, I understand that it has relevance mostly to this plan which was established in 2000 for bringing in the new safeguards agreements and working with the new SQP text, etc. So having understood that, then I came across Lithuania, which to me is not an SQP state. And it is correctly said here that Lithuania is not an SQP state, although, strangely enough, they have the small quantity protocol for the last 20 years, which was not implemented, of course, because Lithuania has nuclear industry and a lot of nuclear material. And having noted Lithuania, I started to read the text about Lithuania and found the following sentence. When Lithuania joined the European Union in 2008, its safeguards agreement with the IAEA was superseded with the Euratom Treaty. And this, sorry to say this, but this is wrong, yeah? So it cannot be, the safeguards agreement cannot be superseded by the Euratom Treaty. It was superseded by the safeguards agreement between non-nuclear weapon states of Euratom and the agency. So that is now the agreement under which the safeguards is implemented in Lithuania. So it is, some people may think it's not important. Some people might think it's not important, but I believe such mistakes should be refuted. So otherwise, it is a very good document, and it is better that it doesn't contain such mistakes. And finally, I would like to say that, of course, these recommendations made by the team are very important. And I think most, or many of them have been already implemented by the agency. And as Kory noted, there are agency representatives here. Susan, who is working in the training, and there is a former training section head here. So they can really probably say that many of these recommendations are being implemented. Thank you.
Thank you. How would you like me to do it? To collect a couple of additional comments and questions, or you want to jump in and answer it?
I made the mistake of not bringing a pen, so I think I should respond while I, thank you, Anka. I think I should at least respond while I still remember all of your comments. First of all, thank you very much for your insightful reactions. Understanding states' experience in safeguards is what we set out to do indeed, but we can talk about titles offline. In terms of SQP states, it's true that many of the countries who have taken action on safeguards in recent years included ones that amended or rescinded their small quantities protocols. But as I said at the beginning of my presentation, there are a number of states who took action on multiple things at the same time. We talk about, for example, Guinea-Bissau, who brought into force a CSA and an AP and an SQP all at the same time. But yes, you're correct that in recent years, a lot of the focus has moved to SQP states, which is one of the reasons why we had so many of them. The case of Lithuania was indeed funny, and it's interesting where most of the countries we spoke to were developing countries. But indeed, the issues that countries face across the three instruments, CSAs, APs, and SQPs, and in this case, between developing and developed countries, were not always dissimilar. Lithuania, as far as the people we spoke to, was not itself aware that it had a non-operational SQP and was a bit bewildered as to how it had received one in the first place. But that emphasizes that these things are very human. These things are very human stories, and it's not always the sort of pretty picture we want to paint for ourselves on paper. But thank you.
Thank you, Noah. Ambassador?
Thank you very much. I want to congratulate you for the report. I'm sorry. Ambassador Soltani, former ambassador to the IAEA, 12 years almost. Well, like him, I am dreaming the safeguards because of 40 years of working with safeguards. But anyway, I congratulate you, the work. A couple of points. The SSS is important, and you dealt it with very eloquently. But the matter is that it is not only that these three officials or authorities, since they are completely different expertise, should work together, but they should not interfere in practice, because I have a lot of experience that one will interfere, then has a serious safety implication, or safeguard, vice versa. Therefore, the matter is coordination in a well-defined discipline. This should be, I think, somehow taken into care. The other issue is what are the real challenges of safeguard? First, politicization of technical work of safeguard. This is the past 3 or 4 decades. This is a matter of serious concern because safeguard is a technical matter. And as long as it is safeguard is doing technical, inspectors are doing, which are really trying honestly to do their technical work, then the member states will have confidence in their work. Therefore, the reasons of some hesitations that you've had, of course, depending who you've interviewed, the countries at the high level who are concerned about their national security, they're concerned about this politicization. Plus, the other issue, which is serious concern in IAEA, is lack of protection of confidential information. When the confidential information is released, which is directly threatening national security of a country, therefore you cannot expect those high authorities listen to your colleague from Sudan to say, okay, let's go and sign it and do it, and tomorrow the inspectors will go anywhere, anytime, because they're concerned. They don't have nothing to hide, but the thing is that the information passed on might have a security. That is the last point, and I really recommend you to, if possible, take into consideration this also along. Of course, you're focusing on advocacy, which is good. And of course, we are for supporting the safeguard as a matter of principles because we need a safe and secure world. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Noah, would you like to respond?
Now that I have a trusty pen, I'm happy to take a couple.
There were several from Ambassador, but are there any other hands? I didn't see it. Not at the moment. Why don't you?
Perhaps I'll respond to that. Yes, so about the 3S, I think 2 recommendations that were contained in the report that had to do with 3S, or perhaps it was mentioned in 3, it was at least 2, have primarily to do with its utility as an approach for countries that have either just established a regulatory body, have not established a regulatory body, or have difficulties in all of the 3S's already. And the reason that this came up in this context was because whether or not these activities have separate expertise, which they do, in some of these countries, the same sort of 4 or 5 people are doing safety, security, and safeguards already. So it doesn't happen in hugely developed countries as much, right? But this was the focus of that. I agree that the 3 should effectively coordinate, but not interfere with each other. But just bear in mind, this was not a blanket recommendation for all countries to establish 3S regulators. It was that this approach could be useful for countries with very little capacity. About other challenges facing the safeguard system, I certainly agree with you. There are many things we could have focused on, but indeed this was focused on outreach and capacity building exercises that are conducted by the agency, but perhaps fodder for one of our next projects.
I'm at your disposal.
Of course. Thank you, Ambassador.
Okay. One right here.
So Susan Pickett, I'm the section head of safeguards training at the IAEA. I want to thank you for the report, and I really appreciate it. As Valerie mentioned, yeah, we've been doing training and support for member states since 1976. I'm looking at Jean-Maurice over there. So 1976 was our first international training course for states, bringing them together. And I think it really evolved, and I appreciate the recommendations. I think some of these we've started to see and are implemented. I think part of the challenge with this too is what states are aware of and at what levels. We have the political level, of course. Do the practitioners get the information that they need, and how do they get it? I would love passionately to say that training can solve every problem, but it can't, and I think some of your recommendations there kind of capture that. There are the challenges that might be the challenges of the organization, be it the ministries, the getting things passed, getting resources to organizations. As you mentioned, sometimes it might just be one person in a state, and is that one person enough to be the state system of accounting for and control of nuclear material? In some states, one person might be enough for an SQP, but the system needs to be there as well. So the related support. For that, can the IAEA do that? I'm not sure. I mean, we can't do everything. Training cannot solve everything, but support cannot solve. But there's a lot that can benefit from perhaps sharing of good practices, states recognizing what they need and the importance and putting more importance of it. I love the idea of states helping states. There's some part of that can be strengthened as well. I think one of the things that we're working to do continuously is look at improving needs assessments of states so that our, and when I say training, it's capacity building, it's engagement. So it's not a one-off training course here, but maybe there's an engagement over time. But that can't be never ending because the states do need to take accountability. And I think that's a really important thing that states, the IAEA, we could keep giving, but at some point states have to take it on too. And so how do you find that right combination? So I think some of the recommendations we'll go back and look at again, but just a couple of thoughts from safeguards training. Thanks.
Yeah, and maybe just to add to that is that the recommendations are not only geared towards the IAEA, they are also are for the states or group of states that conduct some of the outreach, capacity building, and other programs in these countries. So we shouldn't be just thinking that's the only kind of audience for these recommendations.
And indeed, I realized I forgot to respond to that part of your comment, Mr. Buchkov, and thank you, Susan, for bringing it up again. Of course, the agency already implements a huge variety of these activities. Part of the exercise of this study was finding other pathways or other modalities to improve the work that's already being done, not to duplicate the work that the IAEA is doing. So as Elena points out, states and groups of states, but also considering, as I said in one of the recommendations, what can be done at the NPT review conference to help push forward this work? What can be done by states that are not already supporting these activities, and so on. Just wanted to add that as well.
Here? Oh, sorry. After you.
Thank you, Elena. Thank you, Noah. And apologies that I'm off screen. I'm sure that'll be a great loss to the audience at home. But I just thought I'd briefly speak to the purposes of the UK counter-proliferation program. Oh, of course. I'm Mark Duncan. I'm with the... Of course.
Come on in, Mark.
Thank you. I'm Mark Duncan. I'm with the UK delegation to the UN here in Vienna, specifically covering the International Atomic Energy Agency. The UK Counter-Proliferation Programme sponsors research programs and projects into all areas relating to the international non-proliferation system. And in the last year, we were very happy to sponsor VCDNP for this work. And we're very, very grateful for the invaluable research and recommendations that you have generated in the course of this work. The thematic model that you've just described in great detail is certainly one that we apply to our own outreach, and we very much encourage other countries to do so as well. It's obviously an important priority to the UK to strengthen the international safeguard system, particularly for the universalization of all the key safeguards agreements. And we're very grateful to Kory and to the agency for its ongoing and tireless work on verification and safeguards, all based on consistency and cooperation, naturally. And as a country that applies a free yes integrated regulatory approach ourselves, this is obviously a model that we also encourage other countries to adopt, and we welcome this recommendation as one of the many that you've generated. My question would then be just on your intentions of how you intend to take this work forward as well, both within this project and any subsequent areas of work. Thank you.
Should we, okay. So thank you, Mark, for the question. How do we intend to take this forward? This has less to do with the subject matter of the report and more to do with how it is that we as non-governmental organizations sort of navigate the priorities that we place on research. I hate the idea of a non-government or anyone doing research, publishing a pretty report, patting ourselves on the back and putting it on a shelf so it collects dust. So it's really my ambition as a researcher always to anything I put my blood, sweat, and tears in, like this project that we've concluded now, to have that work inform the future aspects of whatever we do, be it talking in conferences at the IAEA, using the recommendations contained in this report to generate future outreach that we might do, or future research projects, future ways that we might take them forward to assist the agency or countries that are doing safeguards, capacity building, and outreach. And indeed, as I mentioned earlier, the VCDNP has its own capacity building activities that we conduct with states, and it would be important for us to sort of learn our own lessons as well. That's a sort of off the cuff, but never know what the future holds, but don't worry, the UK can rest happily and surely that this will not collect dust, Mark.
Very good.
Hello, my name is Valeria Hesse. I am a research fellow at Odessa Center for Non-Proliferation. And I wanted to thank Noah and the team for presenting such an interesting report that actually addresses a lot of things that people have been talking about for a long time. I mean, not just people, experts in the field, and having it summarized is something, and also adding to like the actual research is something that was really needed. My question is, so with you naming the unwilling, unaware, and unable as groups of countries that there exist was SQPs, do you foresee that universalizing for the countries that actually were unaware or unable with external help, they changed their SQPs, and will it somehow push those unwilling? Will it create some pressure from your perspective, or is it just for the sake of the unaware and unable for their future? Is it important only for that? And the other thing that I wanted to say is kind of a recommendation. Or just like put it out there on the table as food for thought. So resources for the organizations are obviously extremely important, and a lot of times the reason why they only have like a particular person responsible for the whole country, for the whole sphere, is the financial side. And it becomes especially important if we're speaking about younger professionals that have to be the generation that change the people currently working on issues. And it would be important to think about how through capacity building and in general in collaboration with countries, it could be support, like the participation of younger people could be supported, and especially from financial side. Thank you.
Thank you, Valeria, for the questions and the recommendation as well. I want to say one thing first about this model about the unwilling, unaware, and unable. Well, two things, I should say. The first is that, and I don't want to put words in Laura's mouth, but if I'm not mistaken, this was first conceived in relation to additional protocols, this way of thinking about it. But I sort of felt with this study that it really applies to all three instruments, right? CSAs, APs, and SQPs. As Mr. Buchkov mentioned, there are many SQP states in this, but that we interviewed. But I think it's a really good way to think about those who have not taken action on safeguards in general. The second thing is that one says this, and sometimes it sounds like unwilling is a slur, and it's really not. It's just some countries are not willing to, for example, conclude an additional protocol, and they have their reasons for that. And that's not really the focus that we wanted to take for this study. I won't name countries, but for states that have political, shall we call them anti-motivations to, for example, conclude an additional protocol, there's not a whole lot that I'm going to be able to do, or anybody else, to change that until their political objection changes. What we have offered is for ways to look at further outreach and capacity building to the unaware and the unable. Will it put pressure on the unwilling? Probably not. But hopefully it will provide bodies that do outreach on safeguards and capacity building with new ways to get to awareness raising, new ways to help build capacity in a sustainable way. And so that was really the focus. If a country comes back to me in 3 years and said, we amended our SQP and it's because of this strategy you suggested, I'll be very happy to hear that. And to the kind viewers online, if your country has taken action on safeguards because it's something that we've done, we're happy to hear about it. In terms of support for young people, I have to say it was interesting to see the diversity in age groups from the people that we interviewed. Because there were some people who had been working on their, for example, nuclear regulatory bodies for 20, 30 years. And there were some people who this was a post that needed filling in their country, and this strapping young woman or man was interested and had the training, and so it was, I can't give you an age, but there were a few people we talked to in their early 20s. And particularly for countries that have very limited capacity, age ain't nothing but a number.
Thank you, Noah. I think we're getting close to the end of our time, and Jenny, you would be our last speaker.
Thank you. Jenny Rissanen from the IAEA Department of Safeguards, team leader for strategic planning and also in charge of non-traditional partnerships. Just wanted to compliment both organizations for doing this kind of work. I think this is the kind of fruit from our partnerships that we really like to see that will help us inform our actions. And in that regard, let me put my strategic planning hat on for a moment. So one of the hardest things that we do in strategy is prioritization. So therefore, Noah, I'm going to put you on the spot. And if you had one recommendation for the IAEA in terms of what we can do, what would that be out of these many very good recommendations? Thanks.
Are you ready?
What the IAEA can do. So I thought you were going to ask what my favorite recommendation in general was, which is going to say there needs to be more money flowing into this in general. But for the IAEA, so again, gentle viewers, if you're out there in a position to give the IAEA more money, that's a lesson. What the IAEA can do, I think that it was interesting to hear from the people who we have spoken to how much of a revelation it was to so many of these countries when they became aware of the services that are already offered. So some of the recommendations have to do with differentiating services or offering new services, but I think it would do a world of difference to, for the IAEA to, not that you don't have other things to do, but make some of these countries, particularly countries that have continued to have outdated SQPs, aware of some of the opportunities that already exist, as I said, that you are responsible for, but also those that states offer. And I don't know how much, sort of along that same vein, I don't know how much push the IAEA can have to say to other countries, we just need more countries doing this. It can't just be a handful of countries. And so if that is something that a priority, that the agency would prioritize, sort of saying that in Director General's reports or in fora where member states are, sort of, you have their ears, to diversify the amount that, the sources of funding going into this kind of work, not just from the IAEA, but in general.
Okay, I know that Jean-Maurice had like a little bit addition, since we still have, I've completely forgot, my apology for the audience online. Do we have any questions? Six? Oh my goodness. Okay, maybe you can quickly let me know the questions while we're taking questions. Yes, Jean-Maurice.
Yeah, so my name is Jean-Maurice Crété, and I was section head of the training section before Suzanne. So she inherited of the disaster I created, so I apologize. but what I observed during the time when we were training SSAC is that the lack of engagement, not of policymakers, we engage them a lot, working level, we engage them a lot, but we almost never engage the lawmakers. And we realized that if we don't engage them, if we cannot convince them that safeguard is important, they will not be interested in passing a law, so there will not be law, no regulation, no license, and therefore no safeguards implementation, because you need a very, very strong regulatory and legal framework. So were there any thoughts given to this aspect of engaging lawmakers or commission in the parliament dealing with nuclear things and so on? Because really, to me, it's a population target that we ignore too much. And just a comment, the 3 categories of people, they are clearly identified in the implementation plan since 2000. And this document is a good one because this is one of the rare documents where IAEA spells things clearly. So I can only invite you to read it carefully. Thank you.
Fantastic. So I'm really need to apologize to our audience online, but Louis, maybe you can quickly You're
more than welcome to email the questions to me. I'm happy to answer them.
Would that work? I hope so. I know you cannot respond to me, but I hope that works. But I know we have received questions.
My email address is available.
That is my fault. Very poor moderating.
My email address is available on vcdnp.org in the experts tab. Scroll down. Feel free to email me. I would be happy to engage.
That's very good. With that, no, we already, yeah. I think we didn't have additional hands, at least in the audience. With that, I think that I really want to thank all of you for joining us today and for your wonderful questions and challenging some of our recommendations or the way it's formulated, but also for those of you who were really supportive and acknowledging some of the benefits and usefulness of these recommendations. Again, many thanks to the IAEA for joining us today and for being such a wonderful partner, and for the UK FCDO for providing funding and supporting this project. And with that, thank you, Noah, and congratulations, Noah, the team, and Alberto for work well done. Thank you.